We have Madea Benjamin. As I said, anybody here doesn't know that. But Madea has been quite the activist for so many years now. And we date back to about the same time, the Vietnam War, becoming aware of what that was all about. And she has dedicated her life to opposing these kinds of things since then. Whether it's Vietnam or subsequently others, but also Iraq War. She has a degree in economics and public health. I don't know whether she does any work in that or not, but she keeps pretty busy and has spent time in Africa, seen some of the world, and in trying to raise awareness of the issues of peace, has spent time in handcuffs, and that's a commitment I've avoided. And I think it's great. We had her here once a bunch of years ago, and now we have a new reason, and that's great. She's done other books, founded Code Pink, which I think is, we had all those color codes back when the Bush administration was doing them. And she has the book War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. And that's hard to do for a lot of people. We know you shouldn't invade another country. Just ask George Bush. But it was acceptable that we go halfway around the world to invade this cradle of civilization area. But there's reasons. So I would be very pleased to welcome Madea Benjamin up here.
Okay? Yeah? Excellent. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here, especially since I see so many of my wonderful peace activists that we've been together in opposing many wars over the years. It's interesting that some of them now are protesting me, which I find humorous on one side and very sad on another side. And it's sad that I'm even here talking about this war, because when are we going to become really civilized people on this planet and stop killing each other? When are we going to stop the killing that both is just invading our own country with the mass shootings that we are seeing as a constant, and then that same kind of idea that it's okay to pick up guns and murder people happening in other countries around the world. Sometimes when we are the obvious aggressor, sometimes when it's another country that is the obvious aggressor, like in the case of Ukraine right now. But the general, overall problem we have is one of killing each other. And you know that it's so counter to human sentiments, because we see from the veterans of these wars how difficult it is for them to reintegrate into society with all the damages that they have, not just physical, but so many mental damages that come from being in a situation where you're taught and told to kill somebody else. It's not a natural state of being. And while we're here, we're lucky enough to be staying, my partner Tig and I, at the Quaker house. And every time we walk in that house, we see that poster that I love so much, which says, "War is not the answer." It comes from Martin Luther King, who said, "War is not the answer." And I think that anytime we get very confused about this war, and the people that we've been in an anti-war movement with for so many years who say, "But this war is different," I say it isn't different. War is the problem, it's not the solution. War is not the answer. It is never the answer. And we have to learn how to deal with conflicts without killing each other. No matter who the aggressor is, we want to stop the aggressor, we want to stop the wars, we want to stop the suffering, we want to stop the pain, we want to stop the killing. And I find it so disconcerting that there are people who really think that this war is so different that there's really going to be, like World War II, there's going to be a victory. There's going to be a winning side. When we already know all sides have lost already. It's a lose-lose. And the question really is, how do we stop the bleeding? So we're going to take 18 minutes to show this video, which is the broad outline of the book that we have, lays out the context as my co-author Nicholas Davis and I see it, and as many people here that I've worked with for many years see it. It is not the only analysis. It might not be 100% correct analysis, but it is an important point of view that people are not seeing in the media.
About the heartbreaking.
Sorry.
Let's do it. Let's watch the video. I'll update you on what has happened since then, and then open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Sorry.
In Ukraine and what we could do to try to end it. Every day the war rages on, civilians and soldiers are being killed. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee and seek asylum in foreign lands. Schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, and infrastructure have been reduced to rubble. We wrote this book to try to help people make sense of a war that should never have happened. A war that has raged on for months and might well rage on for years. A war that could lead to a nuclear confrontation. A war that must be stopped. We know that people have very different opinions about this conflict, and we hope that our book and this talk will foster respectful dialogue. We have not tried to justify or excuse Russia's invasion of Ukraine because we do not think it is justifiable or excusable. We hope we can help you understand the context, the background, and the actions of all the parties that led to this crisis. As U.S. citizens, we have very little hope of influencing the Russian government, but we should be able to influence our own government, which is why it's so important to look at the role the United States has played in fomenting the conflict. Let's look at two elements of U.S. involvement that we highlight in our book: NATO expansion and the events of 2014. Western leaders call NATO a defensive military alliance, but NATO was formed to defend Western Europe from invasion by the Soviet Union. That mission was accomplished when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991. NATO should have been dissolved at the end of the Cold War, along with the Warsaw Pact, which was NATO's counterpart in the Eastern Bloc. Instead, NATO reinvented itself to justify its continued existence. It expanded all the way to Russia's borders, despite many promises that it would not do so, and ignoring warnings from experienced US and Western diplomats that this would lead to a predictable yet entirely avoidable crisis with Russia, as in fact it has. You can see the map showing the various waves of expansion in which NATO incorporated former Soviet republics and Russia's European neighbors. In 2018, the antagonism reached new heights when NATO, under US pressure, publicly promised membership to the former Soviet republics of Ukraine and Georgia. While no definite date was set, NATO began supplying increased levels of military aid and training to Ukraine, including Ukraine, in military exercises. So Russia certainly had legitimate concerns about Ukraine's involvement in an ever-expanding military alliance that was encircling Russia with powerful military forces and had already unleashed aggressive wars and occupations in Kosovo in 1999, Afghanistan in 2001, and Libya and Syria in 2011. The other 42 anti-coup protesters were burned to death by a mob on May 2nd, 2014. The new government in Ukraine was rejected by the parliament in Crimea, and a referendum to rejoin Russia passed overwhelmingly and was accepted by Russia but not recognized by other countries. The provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk also passed referendums declaring themselves independent from Ukraine, leading to a civil war that killed an estimated 14,000 people. Many Ukrainian military units based in this region defected to the self-declared People's Republics or refused to fight their own people. So the Ukrainian government formed new National Guard units to fight the separatists. These included units like the Azov Battalion, recruited from the same neo-Nazi groups that took up arms to spearhead the coup in Kiev in February 2014. The worst fighting of the Civil War ended in February 2015 with the signing of the Minsk II Accord. This was drafted by France, Germany, and Russia, and agreed to by Ukraine and the self-declared republics. It set up a ceasefire and a buffer zone between the warring parties and was monitored by 1,300 monitors and staff from the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. While the ceasefire largely held from 2015 to 2022, the Ukrainian government failed to implement the political aspects of the Minsk II agreement. It had agreed to grant Donetsk and Luhansk a new autonomous status, but each time the Ukrainian government tried to move forward on this, extreme right-wing forces re-exerted their power and insisted that Ukraine must instead keep fighting to recover its lost territories. NATO and the US also bear responsibility for the failure of Minsk II. Despite officially claiming to support the agreement, NATO and the US, under both Trump and Biden, kept building up Ukraine's military, encouraging the Ukrainian government to believe it could eventually recover Donbass and Crimea by force, and that the US and NATO would support that. As tensions were reaching a boiling point in December 2021, Russia took the initiative of drafting two mutual security treaties, one between Russia and the United States and the other between Russia and NATO. These were not take-it-or-leave-it demands, but drafts for negotiation. Unfortunately, the United States and NATO summarily dismissed Russia's proposals. By building up Ukraine's military, promising Ukraine NATO membership, and dismissing negotiations, the US and its allies turned Ukraine into a dangerous weapon in their revived Cold War against Russia. Then, in the days leading up to February's Russia invasion, the OSCE ceasefire monitors documented thousands of explosions around the ceasefire line in Donbass, mostly on the Donetsk and Luhansk side, indicating a major escalation of artillery fire by Ukrainian government forces. So even in the immediate causes of the war, it is deceptive to describe the invasion as unprovoked, as Biden and US officials routinely do. By early 2022, Russia had amassed large military forces near Belarus's border and its own borders with Ukraine, all the while denying that it had plans to invade. It also formally recognized Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as independent countries. On February 24th, Russia invaded. The invasion was illegal on many counts. It was not an act of self-defense, and it certainly was not authorized by the United Nations. Under international law, including the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the UN Charter, the invasion was an illegal crime of aggression. Russia did not just move its invading forces into Donbass to support the breakaway republics, but it launched offensive towards the capital Kyiv and the second largest city, Kharkiv, in the northeast, and into the southern part of Ukraine from Crimea. Western analysts generally agree that Russia must have hoped to take quickly Kyiv and install a friendly government, but it encountered strong resistance from Ukrainian forces and was forced to withdraw from the north. Ukraine's western neighbors responded to the invasion by granting asylum to millions of refugees, while the US and other NATO countries poured billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine, stepped up their training of Ukrainian military, and provided it with intelligence to accurately attack important Russian targets. There's been little or no accountability for the weapons flooding into Ukraine. There are reports that as little as 30% of them may be reaching the front lines because they are either destroyed by Russian missiles or siphoned off into the black market, where they could end up in the hands of the Islamic State, neo-Nazis, or other dangerous groups around the world. This was precisely why the US Congress prohibited the transfer of US weapons to the Azov Regiment in 2018, as it became a magnet and a hub for international right-wing militant networks. Yet after the Russian invasion, all restraints were lifted, and thousands of tons of powerful and advanced weapons have poured in over the Polish border. There was so little debate about this in the US that when Congress passed an enormous $40 billion package for Ukraine, with most of the money to be spent on more and more lethal weapons for up to another decade, not a single Democrat voted against it. Not even Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who cast the lone, wise, and prophetic vote against the disastrous war in Afghanistan in 2001. In our book, we explain the peace negotiations in Turkey in March that could have already ended this war, and the largely unreported role of the US and British governments in killing those talks. The talks during the first month of the war produced the contours of a 15-point peace plan for a ceasefire, a Russia withdrawal, and a future for Ukraine as an independent, peaceful, and neutral country. On March 27th, President Zelensky told a national TV audience, "Our goal is obvious: peace and the restoration of normal life in our native state as soon as possible." Under the draft agreement, Ukraine would neither be a military ally of the United States and NATO, nor of Russia, with no foreign military bases or installations on its territory. Ukraine would get security guarantees from other countries. Russian speakers in Ukraine would be free to speak, read, and study in Russian. And the future of Crimea and Donbass would be determined by an internationally accepted political process during a transition period of several years. But none of that came to pass. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson went to Kyiv on April 9th and told Prime Minister Zelensky that the UK would not be party to any agreement between Ukraine and Russia, and that the collective West, as he called it, saw a chance to press Russia and was determined to make the most of it. Turkish diplomats who had been mediating the ceasefire talks reported that U.S. Defense Secretary Austin delivered a similar message to Zelensky, and that these messages effectively killed their peace efforts. So early hopes for a negotiated peace were dashed, largely as a result of U.S. and British determination to weaken Russia, even at the cost of rivers of Ukrainian blood, in an open-ended war that could last for years. The undermining of ceasefire talks was a tragic lost opportunity. Since the talks were abandoned, the slaughter and destruction has continued, with hundreds of Ukrainians killed every day. Russia has taken control of more territory, and despite the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russia now occupies 20% of Ukraine. The sanctions against Russia have backfired, leading to soaring energy prices worldwide, while reduced grain exports have led to widespread hunger, particularly in the global south. Europe is facing an energy and home heating crisis. Meanwhile, no side has honestly or publicly explained what its goals are in this war, or why they can possibly justify the total destruction of Ukraine and even the greater danger of nuclear war. Even the old war hawk Henry Kissinger is warning that U.S. policy has blundered to the brink of a world war, with no clear purpose or endgame in sight. He told the Wall Street Journal, "We are at the edge of war with Russia and China on issues which we partly created, without any concept of how this is going to end or what it's supposed to be. We distribute our messages via social media, and we educate the public, including getting our book into libraries and classrooms. And we encourage you to join us. We must act now to say, stop the bloodshed, stop the bombing, stop the madness. We must work together to demand a ceasefire and negotiations, not more war." Thank you.
So a couple of things that have happened since we wrote the book and made the video that actually reinforce some of the arguments that we made. For example, on the Minsk agreements, in addition to what we had said, more recently there were interviews with the heads of Germany and France, two separate interviews at that time, and that was Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel. And in those interviews, they basically agreed that the Minsk agreements were an opportunity to buy time to arm Ukraine. And so what we saw was, instead of that peace agreement being implemented with pressure from those European countries that were supposed to help guarantee the implementation, we saw instead the weapons start coming in. And from the United States, it was first under Obama, where he said it was going to be only defensive weapons, and then Trump came in and lifted that stipulation, started sending in all kinds of weapons, as well as training about 10,000 Ukrainian members of the military every single year. So we see that agreement basically end up as a piece of paper and not implemented. And then, as we talked about in here, the negotiations that were happening early on after the war started, which is the time when it's most possible to come to negotiations before the two sides get so hardened. We talk about here what was reported by the Turkish officials involved in the talks, reported in a well-respected Ukrainian newspaper, that it was the presence of Boris Johnson that said, "We don't want these talks to go forward." Well, many people said, no, that's not true, didn't believe it. But then we have more recently an interview that came out with another head of state who was trying to negotiate, and that is the head of Israel at the time, Naftali Bennett. Now, some of us might think Naftali Bennett could have stayed home and tried to negotiate a peace deal in his own country, but he was shuttling between Kyiv and Moscow, trying to come up with a ceasefire. And he said that there were positive results from that on both sides, and that the West blocked the agreement. So there is another example. And now we have the most recent example, which is the Chinese peace proposal. It is not a proposal that lays out specifics of what might happen to Donbass or Crimea. It's a proposal that lays out a set of 12 principles. And after talking to Putin, the Chinese leader got positive response. There was positive response from Zelensky as well. But the US immediately dismissed these efforts by the Chinese, said it would be illegal to have a ceasefire because that would solidify Russia's gains, and basically made fun of China as a negotiator. And this comes after China had done a quite remarkable negotiation with two Middle Eastern countries that had been enemies for quite some time, that's Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it seemed like China was ready to come out on the world stage as a peacemaker. But the US pushed that aside. And so time and time again, we see the US either stymie or torpedo peace agreements, and certainly not propose its own idea for a peace plan. In fact, the US has hidden behind the idea that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, that it's the Ukrainians that have to decide. And yet, when Ukrainians were involved in peace talks, the US and the UK pushed back on them. And yet, there are issues that the US should be talking about directly with Russia itself, because there is a piece of this conflict that is a geopolitical conflict. And when you look at the Secretary of State of this country, Anthony Blinken, who is supposed to be the #1 diplomat, he had almost no contact with his counterpart in Russia this entire time, except for getting the freedom for Brittany Griner, and also a 10-minute meeting on the sidelines of a G20 meeting. That is not negotiations. And so recently in Congress, when he was testifying about the title of the congressional hearing was Diplomacy in the United States for 2023, and we heard him speak about everything from except diplomacy, myself and some of my colleagues in Code Pink decided that we were going to step up and ask him, why isn't he doing his job as a diplomat? That is what he is hired to do. And I said, if you don't like the Chinese peace plan, where is your peace plan? And for that, I was dragged out and arrested. But I think it's a very important question that we should all be asking our government. If you don't like the Chinese peace plan, what are the parts of it that you like or don't like? And where is your plan? And what are you going to do to push all sides to the negotiating table? Because we see that there are talks that are happening on specific issues. For example, Ukraine and Russia are talking about the issue of getting the grain out of Russia and out of Ukraine, grain that was so needed to go to Africa and the Middle East. And that grain deal gets renegotiated every 3 or 6 months, and it has been very successfully negotiated. There are problems with it right now because the governments of Poland and Hungary are saying that grain isn't going where it's supposed to go, which is to the hungry countries in Africa. Instead, it's staying in Europe and bringing down the prices and hurting farmers in their countries. In fact, they have just said that they are going to block grain from Ukraine. But my point is to say that Russia and Ukraine have been negotiating about grain and getting fertilizers out of Russia that are so important for farmers around the world as well. And that there have been talks about the tremendous danger posed by the fighting around the nuclear plants, particularly the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. And when it looked like there was going to be an explosion in that plant with radioactive material being sent all over Europe, there were negotiations to get representatives of the International Atomic Energy Agency into that plant. It is still a very dangerous situation, but at least there are members of that agency there, as well as international folks. In fact, I just got a note today from a group of Americans called the Zaporizhzhia Peace Project that are there as citizen representatives, trying to make sure that there is not an explosion in that plant. And then we have the issue of prisoners swaps that is happening on a regular basis between Ukraine and Russia. And I just think of what it must take to do one prisoner swap. When you come up with, we're going to have 300 prisoners from our side, 300 from your side, the logistical nightmare that that must entail, the kind of trust that has to be gained to say, okay, your side's going to do what you say and this side's going to do what it says. That is happening on a regular basis. We don't hear about it in the news, but it's probably happening about every 2 weeks, as well as negotiations to get the bodies of fallen soldiers out, to deal with the issue of wounded soldiers. There are weapons. The latest AP poll showed that only 48% of Americans wanted the U.S. to continue sending weapons to Ukraine. That's a very, very big leap from what we see and hear coming out of Congress and coming out of the White House. Yet, those of us who have been organizing find that there's tremendous receptivity when we can get our message out, because there is a lot of censorship in our own press. But when we can get our message out and talk to people, we find a lot of people agreeing with us. For example, we are here in a place of worship right now, and we worked with the group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is an over 100-year-old organization that's been working against war and supporting conscientious objectors throughout its history. And we said, let's reach out to faith-based leaders and ask them to call for a truce. We thought we'd be lucky if we got 100 leaders, and we got over 1,500 representing every single faith that exists. And they include people like Reverend Barber from the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Jesse Jackson, people who understand how bad this war is, certainly for the people of Ukraine and the soldiers that are dying, but also how it affects us here at home. And we also heard something that was not in the press at all when the mayors, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, it brings together 1,400 mayors from all of the major cities in the United States, and when they got together this year, they put out a resolution calling for vigorous efforts for negotiation, because they understand how this war affects people in their own cities. And so we see that there are lots of people in our community that we respect who agree with us that we have to do more to push our own government. And I want to end by saying that this is a reflection that we see on the global level in a massive way, because countries, especially those in the global south, are demanding that the countries that have some leverage push that leverage to start these peace talks. We saw that at the COP27 meeting, when the countries come together to talk about the crisis in the environment. That was right after the flooding in Pakistan, when a third of the country was underwater, and the representatives from Pakistan were saying, you put $100 billion into war, but you will never fulfill your obligation for the Global Climate Fund that you're supposed to put $100 billion to help the poorer countries deal with the crisis that you and the wealthy countries have created. You hear that at international venues in the last year. And the voice that I think represents that call from the global south is the voice of the president of Brazil, President Lula. Because he was pushed by Biden to send weapons to Ukraine. And he met with Biden in the White House not long ago. And he said afterwards, no, we said we would not send weapons to Ukraine. What is really needed is interlocutors who will talk to the Russians to say what a terrible mistake they made by invading Ukraine, and talk to the Ukrainians to say how necessary it is that they go for negotiations. And he said, we need to create a peace club of nations that will come together for this, because we do not want to join this war, we want to end this war. And I think that's the sentiment that we should echo here in the United States. Let's stop fueling this war. Let's stop pushing for a war that the victims are the Ukrainians who die in this war every single day. Let's stop sending more weapons, and let's start pushing for negotiations. We don't want to fuel this war. We want to end this war. Thank you. One of the important things is to stay in touch with each other as we come up with ideas. We are working with our European counterparts on a gathering in Vienna that's going to happen on June 10th to see how we can come together to be more effective. And certainly there are a lot of efforts here at home that we keep coming up with. So we're going to pass around this sign-up sheet. We'd love it if you would sign up here so that we can stay in touch with you. And I know we have a lot of people that are very opinionated in this audience here.
Including
from
me.
all sides. And so let's open it up.
I just want to mention
Yeah.
one thing. If you could, because we don't have mics, if you could stand up and speak as loudly as you could if you're going to ask a question, please.
And let's try to keep those to 1 minute each so that we can get to a lot of people and their questions or disagreements or whatever you would like to say. So if we could see a show of hands of people who would like to speak. Wendy, why don't we start? No, with Wendy.
Well, Madea, as we have spoken about, I've known you for 20
Can you
years.
speak louder, please?
I've known Madea for 20 years. When she said jump, I said how high. She has been my hero for 20 years. But I'm sorry, to me, this war is different. And I could go on and on. I'm against war. I don't believe everything the U.S. government says. I fought as hard as I could against the invasion of Iraq. I did everything I could think of when I was working full time. But what I want to ask is, I have a million things I'd like to ask, but where is the Budapest Agreement in the 18-minute movie? Because I feel that the Budapest Agreement, memorandum, security agreement was very important. Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. I wish we all would. But now they've been invaded by a nuclear-armed country, and now you see Japan, who we bombed, as we all know, with the nuclear weapons, the only country that's ever used them. Now we see Japan building up their military. We see everybody wanting to join NATO because everybody is afraid. And they have good reason to be afraid of us, I agree, but they have a lot of reason to be afraid of Russia. And with what Russia has done to Ukraine, you know, Putin, the one man that can back out
I don't disagree with you. Russia violated the Budapest Agreement, and it sent a terrible signal to other countries, just like the U.S. invading a country like Iraq that didn't have nuclear weapons, and yet not invading a country like North Korea because it does have nuclear weapons. All of those send terrible messages. And I agree with you that this invasion has led to greater militarization around the world, and that's a terrible thing. The question is, how do you stop it? The Russians are not going to just pick up and leave. Putin is not going to say, all right, I've been defeated, this is over. That's just not going to happen. We also have to take into account that there are people in Ukraine, in other parts of Ukraine, like in the Donbass and Crimea, that have sympathies towards Russia, that have shown in various ways, through votes, through referendums, that they are sympathetic to Russia. So that's why these are contested regions. We also have to recognize that powerful countries do things that are not right and should not be condoned, but they get away with it because they're powerful. And we know that living in the United States, where we have said for 200 years, there's a Monroe Doctrine that no foreign military alliance could come into our backyard, all of Latin America. And yet, when Russia says no hostile foreign military alliance along our borders, NATO doesn't listen to them. And so it has to be understood that Russia has security concerns that it is going to fight for. Whether we agree with them or not, whether we think they're right or not, Russia is going to fight for them. Putin is not going to just pick up and leave Ukraine. Like vultures to say, we are going to replace Russian energy. And when you talk about the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, I remember way before this war happened, how in hearings in Congress, there would be senators like Ted Cruz from Texas who would be hammering on the table saying, we must stop the Nord Stream pipeline. We can't let the Germans negotiate with the Russians for this pipeline. It's not fair, because he's in a state where there is a lot of money to be made from this dirty energy, and they wanted to be selling it to Europe and not having Russia. And so the fact that they made their record profits last year, and the fact that they are able now to get all kinds of concessions that they weren't able to get before from the US government, whether it's the Willow Project in Alaska, whether it's fracking here in New York State, whether it's the increase of production and refinery in the Gulf states in Texas and Louisiana, the efforts of people to stop that expansion has been blown aside by this war. And so we do have to recognize there are people who make profits from war. And the last area I think we have to look at, or another area we have to look at, is the profits that companies are looking at potentially in the rebuilding of Ukraine, because that's going to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that's going to be put into rebuilding. And we already see that there are memorandum of understanding that are being signed by Zelensky with some of the most vulture-type financial groups. The biggest one in this country is BlackRock, and they already signed a memorandum with BlackRock. So we know that there are many companies that are just chomping on the bit, and there's even a website that has Zelensky's picture on it with a quote of him calling for investments for the rebuilding of Ukraine, saying that this is the greatest opportunity since World War II. So certainly there are a lot of companies making money from this war and anticipating making money from reconstruction as well, instead of letting it be the Ukrainians themselves who benefit from the reconstruction.
As a longtime peace activist, I've really appreciated your criticism in past years. As a longtime peace activist, I've really appreciated your criticism in past years of U.S. government imperialist behavior in Latin America, particularly the Caribbean and in Central America. But it seems to me that in your writings and in this talk tonight that you've shown on the screen, you've been inconsistent when it comes to Russian government imperialist behavior in Eastern Europe. In your talk on the Ukraine war and the film, you painted a picture of U.S. government villainy and therefore tended to justify the brutal Russian invasion, occupation, and annexation of Ukraine, even though you say the Russians shouldn't have invaded. But nonetheless, the picture you paint in the history you've given is one that predominantly blames the United States. I can't talk more on that. Oh.
The United States has been trying to destroy the
Could I
Soviet
finish
Union
that?
for more than a century.
didn't hear
And
me.
it's culminating in that.
Let's let the man finish and have one person answer him
Yeah.
back, please.
If your solution to U.S. military intervention in Latin America can be summarized as Yankee go home, why isn't your solution to Russian military aggression in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, Russians go home?
Well, that was what was being negotiated in March. The negotiations that the U.S. sabotaged were Russians would go home and Ukraine would be a neutral country. And yes, that was, well, of course that was being negotiated. I can give you word for word what Zelensky even said to the public. He said, I will give this to the public to vote on, but we are going to have to make concessions. We wanted to be part of NATO. It looks like we're not going to be able to have that. But we will get guarantees by strong countries, and the Russians will leave and we will end this war. That was being negotiated. Now, I live in the United States, and so do you. If I lived in Russia and you lived in Russia, we would not be having this event tonight. We would probably all be in prison for our opposition to the Russian invasion. But we are here in the United States. And so our job is to say, what can and should our government be doing? This gentleman just talked about how the U.S. had been trying to destroy the Soviet Union for when the Soviet Union existed, created and has been anti-Russian. The older generation, you say Russia, they think Cold War, anti-Russia. We had 10 years about Russiagate, that it was Russia that led to the triumph of Donald Trump rather than a bad campaign run by Hillary Clinton. And you have people who are primed in this country. Now, we are here to say, in the United States, we should also stop interfering in the affairs of other countries. Russia should not have invaded Ukraine. The U.S. should not be involved in the internal affairs of Ukraine. And did you want to say something?
I'm 100% in agreement with that.
Oh, just to add, Pentagon papers, the ones that are released, show Western forces in Ukraine, thing that we weren't supposed to do.
So these Pentagon papers, another important issue that you bring up, it shows that there are special operation forces from the U.S., from the UK, from Latvia, from where else? About 5 other countries. And it showed a number of other things that are important. And unfortunately, the U.S. press has focused on how the heck did a 21-year-old gamer get access to these secret documents instead of focusing more on what is the content of that. In addition to telling us that there are these special operation forces from numerous Western countries there, it also told us that there is a stalemate in Ukraine, that even if there is a spring counteroffensive by Ukraine, it will not significantly change the correlation of forces on the battlefield.
What?
That this is what the Pentagon papers say. You can disagree with it, but it's not me that is saying
You're
that.
making this up. You're making up. Wait, are we having any kind of order here?
So let's have a little order. So it is very important, the information that we got from this leak, and to recognize that this is information that should not be hidden from the American public, because it's information that we need to know to make the judgments about how much we want our government to continue along the path of a war that is not winnable in the battlefield. Yes.
I have a very brief statement. Thank you for calling on me. I'll see if I can remember it. No, really. I agree with what you say about the media. You know, they go for the soundbite, and I do my very best to read the New York Times and the Washington Post, or not Post, but whatever, you know, Washington paper. Do you have a recommendation of some other source? I mean, I don't want to go on the internet and just Google the source. And you obviously know people that tell you what went on in the peace negotiations. I'd appreciate any suggestions you have for additional information so I don't have to rely on what this group says or that group says. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I think we can have some collective response because it will show the wide range of sources that people use, and it's good to have a wide range of sources. As far as where I get my information, I get it from, first I read the mainstream papers. I do read the New York Times and the Washington Post. And then I look for alternative sources of information. Places where I get published, I think, have good information, like Common Dreams, Counterpunch. There's a libertarian site called antiwar.com. And others want to say, oh yes, Democracy Now.
Don't forget Peace and Planet News.
Peace and Planet News. Who else wants to say where they get their information? What'd you say? BBC and Al Jazeera.
I mean, it's not really news.
Lots of people have channels on there, but it's a service and a platform which is perhaps the only place where you can hear the other side of this issue, the Russian side. I can hear Ukrainian and Russians. Every Sunday, I meet with a group of Ukrainians that are living in Russia. Russia has taken in more Ukrainians during this war than any other country on earth, twice as many.
They're stealing Ukrainians.
This group on Sunday that I talk with points to a lot of sources, sends things, but it's very, very difficult to get information. And I just want to, while I'm standing, if I can, just say a couple of things. Larry here talks about Russian imperialism. As a socialist, I understand imperialism is a stage of capitalism. Russia is at a very low stage of capitalism. It doesn't have a very big industrial base. It is primarily a commodity capitalism. Because it's the largest landmass in the world of any country. It has oil, and it has gas, and it has lots of food. It trades on those things. It doesn't have a huge industrial base. So it's not imperialist in the same way the United States is. This is a country on their border. When we had a Cuban Missile Crisis, where we thought there was going to be missiles in Cuba, we went crazy and almost went to World War III. Why can't they have the same thing? We learned from things like the Rand Report that they want to stretch and destroy Russia, from other reports that they want to divide it into 5 pieces. They have been involved in regime change in one country after the next. The U.S. has 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries in the world combined. That's imperialism. We are in the heart of that beast, and we must end that imperialism. Stop talking about the enemy of the United States as being the bad person.
The source you spoke of is called Telegram.
Telegram. Look up.
In all this
Well, wait 1 second. So, Joe, you go on Telegram, how are they supposed to find these?
Well, there's a whole bunch that you could find there. Do you want to name some, like,
Well, there's the Donbass Babushka,
And here?
there's a load of things.
You can
But
go
you'll
to
see both
YouTube.
Russian and-
YouTube has all
and
information from
you can
Ukraine
just look them up.
and propaganda from Russia, and when you hear Russian sources, you will hear exactly what Mrs. Madea is talking about. This is very correlated to Russian propaganda. So in all this speech, I did not hear that all the countries are involved in negotiations. I did not hear any voice from Ukraine that all the countries are deciding what Ukraine should do. And in your speech, it is hidden message that Ukraine should give up its territory and its people. You just mentioned that you know how it's terrible in Russia to live and not to criticize the government. We are sitting in these nice premises criticizing openly government of the United States, and you know that in Russia you cannot do this. So that is why we propose Ukraine to give up its territory and its people to Russia, who will not be able to criticize the government. As you said, as you mentioned, they will be killed. Ukrainians know what is freedom is. They don't want to go under Russia. Why you are deciding here that they need to go to Russia to give up their territory and people, so you will feel safe or whatever.
Are you going to answer it?
I agree. I support the message from
You're not.
the Budapest Agreement. You need to know the fact that it was forced from West and the United States because it was general kind of progressive idea that the nuclear weapons will be in one hand when the Soviet Union collapsed on 15 other states. They forced Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons to Russia. And now those bombs, those rockets, without nuclear inside, they are bombing Ukraine now. And that Mr. Clinton said sorry for this, that he did, that he forced this Budapest Agreement. And what Budapest Agreement that assures that United States, Britain, and Russia will keep Ukraine sovereign and independent and territorial integrity of this country. And now everything is collapsed, and Russia is first who was violating this agreement. So United States feel the obligation as well as Great Britain. So that is why, and the weapons which are going there, those are not the newly made weapons. Those are weapons which are standing in Nevada and Arizona for years and will need to be replaced anyway. Let me just ask you, where do you think this is going? Where is this going to lead? What positive outcome?
The
will it
only
have?
way is to get the peace in the world, the stable peace, is defeat Russia. If Russia will not be defeated,
No, Russia.
there will
World
not
War
be
III.
stable peace. We
You
have
want to fight
peace agreement.
You want to fight World War III?
Peace for 8 years and
You want
that's
a
it.
nuclear war?
The next
Which
war
one?
will be even worse.
You want to negotiate with Nazis?
Okay, I'll
You want to
tell you.
negotiate with Putin because you're fascist?
First of all, Putin is not, it never be called a Nazi. So you can stop.
Okay, let's have the
Support fascism.
That's what you do.
Okay, let's have the
Russians lost 27 million people to Nazism. You cannot do it.
Calm down.
Why do we think we have the right in this country to decide what should be going on the other side of the world?
Right.
Why do we think we are the country that has the right to tell every other country in the earth what kind of government they should have?
Terry.
All
Why don't we
right.
have a chairperson?
I don't understand how you talk loud. I'm too loud. I'm gonna sit down.
I said, why don't we have a chairperson?
It's clear what you say. It's a lot of
Madea?
Look, So there's a, yeah.
What do we got over here?
Yeah, there's a rich panoply of independent media on YouTube, which is, you should be able to access despite the censorship. Madea was on one of the shows, Jimmy Dore's show recently. There's Redacted, the Duran. There's many other, Kim Iverson, Rising. There's tons of shows on YouTube that give you an alternative view, and they need the eyeballs. So there's no excuse, really, in my opinion, to not be ignorant about this question.
So I just would like to talk about the Washington Post. The Washington Post just put out a story that's titled, "Egypt Nearly Supplied Russia with Rockets." Egypt. I was in Egypt when the revolution took place in Tahrir Square. It's the greatest display of democracy, where people rose up and took back their government. 30 years of dictatorship ruled by the United States of America. Put Mubarak in place. These people rose up. People died. People got hurt. I was arrested several times. I was pelted with rocks just for standing around and watching. But it says here, Egypt nearly supplied Russia with rockets. Now it suddenly agreed to give these rockets to Ukraine because the Biden administration told them they're no longer going to give them their $1.5 billion in weapons to suppress their own people. We're talking about a real dictator here. We're not talking about petty anti-dictators. This guy jailed 40,000 people in a minute when he took over his country in a coup that we could have let Morsi go one more year and they could have new elections and we could have possibly had a free Egypt. But no, the United States once again fomented a coup again in Egypt. And now it says in the Washington Post that the United States strong-armed a dictatorship to send weapons into a war. Well, I mean, how much more do you need?
I'll make one comment there, which goes back a long ways. Major General Smedley Butler, United States Marine Corps 4-star general, wrote a book called War is a Racket. Now, if you want to go back to the 1920s, when he said, I have been a thug for the United States, and he lists the countries that he has rigged elections in, that he has led invasions of. So why should we be using American Marines to guard fuel tanks in China? It really lays it out as a whole bunch, and it goes on. If you look at, September 11, 1973, there was a socialist elected president of Chile.
To terrorists and extremists. So somebody who believes in feminism will be in jail in Russia pretty soon. So these are all the things that you do when you give up this. But however, would you negotiate with Hitler? I would say there is no negotiation with Adolf Hitler. There is no negotiation with Excuse me, please, can I please finish? Can I please finish?
Everybody's not Adolf Hitler to you, man.
People raise their hand if they want to talk.
We have a woman back here who'd like
So
to...
that is, when you call this unprovoked, provoked thing is where Russia was never invaded. This is illegal war. Russia needs to go back, and that's the only way. Now, the first counterattack by Ukraine freed up almost 50% of conquered territory. We would never know what happened in Bucha if it wasn't for the release of those territories and the freedom that Ukrainians brought. They released 50% of what Russia conquered. We're going to release more people and free more people from the Russian oppression. And that's what's going to happen in the next month. And no document from Pentagon were not correct because there is no, that is not what's written. But I'd love to see a written document that confirmed by Pentagon. Thank you.
If Donald Trump were to say that if elected,
he would end arms shipments to Ukraine and would pressure the Ukrainians to accept an unconditional ceasefire. Would you support him for re-election?
No, I wouldn't.
I'll try to speak loud. I'm not good at that, but I agree there are so many reasons to stop this war. It is just devastating globally. I take exception to your argument, maybe it was an implication that Russia invaded primarily because NATO was expanding. I happen to believe that that was only part of the reason, that the larger part of the reason was simply to gain more territory. They have learned in the past that they can do that. And so my question to you is, yes, I love the idea of negotiations. How do you do that without giving up territory in Ukraine and teaching not just the Russians, but the Chinese and who knows else?
And the United States, maybe?
Wait, excuse me, please be polite. How do you do that without basically facilitating more of this in the future? I really would like your feedback on that.
Do you believe that there are people in Donbass and Crimea that are sympathetic to Russia?
Of course.
So those are Ukrainians as well. And that's why there's contested territory. And with Crimea having been part of Russia for 100 years, that even before Putin was there was a referendum that was taken after Ukraine declared its independence with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, where the vast majority of Ukrainians said they did not want to be part of Ukraine. That was way before Putin. And so you have to take into account that these are contested areas, and that's why there was a Minsk agreement, and that was never implemented.
But my understanding is that that sentiment has been changing in those areas.
Well, that's your sentiment. That's what you're understanding from the material that you're reading. I don't know that that's the reality on the ground, but when you're in peace negotiations, part of it is that there would be internationally supervised referendums, that there would be a chance for the people to have a voice in how they want to be governed. Those are the kinds of things that you negotiate. And so, if you take a position that this war will not be won on the battlefield without it extending to a massive war, that Zelensky was ready to concede territory back in March, and that this is what happens in negotiations. You make compromises, and that there is no reason to trust either side. Certainly Russia has violated its agreements going back to the Budapest Agreement. Certainly the U.S. has violated agreements that it had with Russia. The IBM Treaty, all of the treaties that Trump pulled out of, and even Bush pulled out of, including negotiations that Russia was part of for the talks around the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, there are many reasons not to trust Russia, not to trust Ukraine, not to trust the U.S., but that's why you have negotiations, and that's why you need mediators, and there are plenty of mediators. There are possibilities from the Vatican to the UN to all of these countries that have come forward to say that they would like to help in the mediation. But I think that is realistically the only way that you're going to see an end to a conflict that hasn't been raging for 1 year, has been raging for at least the last 9 years.
But if we get negotiations, what happens to all the defense profits? We'll need a different war, maybe Iran.
So I think we should take a last round and then wrap up here so that we can keep this discussion going in an informal way.
Can I respond to that? All of Ukraine was part of Russia for centuries. Now, if it was acceptable for ethnically Ukrainian portions of the Soviet Union to secede from Russia, why shouldn't it be equally acceptable for ethnically Russian portions of Ukraine to secede from Ukraine?
So let's have just one, I think everybody, you've got your hand raised, you've had a chance to speak, you haven't had a chance to speak.
Yeah. So this question is a little off topic, but it's always something I always find fascinating with the anti... Yeah. So this question is just slightly off topic, but it does relate to the anti-war left. When Joe Biden was elected, there was a lot of fear among the progressive left, that he was going to follow in the footsteps of, other hawkish Democrats, particularly, Barack Obama. Do you consider the foreign policy of President Biden to be more hawkish than you feared, or less hawkish than you feared? And what do you consider to be the best parts of the Biden foreign policy and the worst parts of the Biden foreign policy?
Yeah, I think the presidency of Biden has been way more hawkish than I had anticipated. I anticipated that in the first couple of weeks in office, he would have gone back into the Iran nuclear deal. That in the first couple of weeks in office, he would have gone back to the Obama policy of normalization of relations with Cuba, for example. And I would have thought that in a situation like this, he would be a lot more open to a more rational position. That is the position that the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said, which is seize the moment, go for negotiations. So I have been very, very disappointed in the foreign policy of Biden. I think it's been instead of following on the footsteps of some of the best things that Obama did, because there were those two good things at least of the Iran nuclear deal in Cuba, he has taken the worst of the Obama years and the worst of the Trump years and put those together. So I think it's been a really bad foreign policy. On top of that, I think he has used economic sanctions extensively and been in this presidency one of the harshest in terms of going after companies and individuals that they think violated the sanctions, so implementing those sanctions in a harsher way. I think the way that he has operated vis-a-vis China has been terrible. The rhetoric allowing people in his party like Pelosi to go to Taiwan and be very provocative. Supposedly he didn't authorize that, but then supposedly he actually did. So I would say in general, this has been a very, very disappointing presidency when it comes to using diplomacy, and that we see the result being that every year of the Biden presidency, there's been an increase in the militarization of the budget, an increase in the money going to the Pentagon, and we've seen a constant diminishing of the Department of State, and we see a Secretary of State who might as well be in the Pentagon for the way that he performs his duties.
We have just one more.
Bring together and work with the Europeans is going to be so important. Just to give you an example, in Germany, there were two women, one being the leading feminist in Germany and one being the head, a member of the German parliament from the left party, put out a petition extremely critical of Russia and its invasion, but extremely urgent in calling for negotiations. And they have gotten over 800,000 people in Germany to sign onto that petition. So there is a growing call and growing divisions inside Europe itself about how to proceed on this. And I think as we wrap up here, I want to say that I am glad that people came here who have different opinions. I thank you for coming. I think this kind of robust debate is really important. And it's important that we all are here for one reason, which we care about Ukraine. And that's more than a lot of people in this country can say for them. So let's recognize our differences, but let's also recognize our commonality. And those commonalities are really important. And as we move forward with the different positions that we carry and the weight that we have in trying to get more people on our side, to recognize that perhaps our biggest opponent is people who don't care, is the apathy.
Yeah.
And that's the people we have to reach. We have to get them to care about what's happening in the world, of course care about what's happening in your own neighborhood, but we have to also be global citizens and realize that this war affects people everywhere, just as wars in general do, and that it is our job as human beings on this planet to work harder and harder and harder so that we do evolve as a civilization to one where we don't put so much of our resources and our energy in who we're going to hate, who our enemies are, and how we're going to kill them in a more sophisticated fashion. But instead, we put our energies and resources into love and compassion and kindness and working